This bridge is the secret weapon that helped the Allies win the Second World War. This is a Bailey Bridge, and its debut on the battlefield, first in the Allied invasion of North Africa, then Italy, then following D-Day and the invasion of Western Europe during World War II, was revolutionary.
The secret of its success is in its design. The interchangeability of its parts makes its construction comparatively simple. Whatever the extent of enemy demolitions, whatever the difficulties of the site, there is a variation of the bridge to fill the gaps.
It's hard to overstate just how much this simple bridge completely changed the face of warfare. In fact, so important to the war effort was this bridge that its development was as secretly controlled as some of the most top secret developments of the war. The Americans may have had the Manhattan Project, but the British had the Bailey Bridge. In many ways, the Bailey Bridge reminds me a lot of the jerry can, an underrated logistical solution that completely changed the face of warfare. And like the jerry can, it was the simplicity and genius of every element of the design that lended so much to its success. I have here an original late 1940s instruction manual for putting together a Bailey Bridge. This is what would be handed out to engineers and the like when they were assembling and planning how to build one of these. And the thing that will shock you the most when you look through this is just how few parts went into the main superstructure of the bridge. You have the panel, the real revolutionary component of the bridge that gives it its strength. It's all joined together simply by panel pins and split pins. You have the transoms, which are the sections that are running horizontally, I suppose, across to create the span. And then you have the wooden runners that create the roadway. Now, of course, there's lots of other little small components, but generally speaking, if you had those basic parts, you could build a Bailey Bridge without any welding, without any major tools, without even really much engineering knowledge. But the real genius of the Bailey Bridge's design is not just in the way that it was constructed, but in the way that that simplicity of its construction was lent to the battlefield environment. One of these bridges could be built by a team of men using only simple tools, launched across a gap using manpower alone without any setup required on the other side. In the face of retreating German forces in Italy or France or the Rhine, they could watch in horror as the bridge that they just blew up was replaced by a better, stronger Bailey Bridge, launched across the gap in a matter of hours by only a small team of engineers using manpower alone. So impactful was the development of this simple bridge behind me here that General Eisenhower, the supreme commander of Allied forces, described it as one of the 3 most important developments of the war, alongside the heavy bomber and radar. I love the Bailey Bridge because it is like the perfect example of British grit, determination and invention during the Second World War. Developed by a country that was on the back foot, that needed an efficient and effective solution, and created one that was so effective that it is still in use, relatively unchanged to this very day. And like so many great inventions of the Second World War, it was developed by a bunch of guys working out of an office somewhere in a damp corner of England. And the man who developed this, led the team who created the Bailey Bridge and lent his name to it, Donald Coleman Bailey, started it all by sketching a simple drawing on the back of an envelope. Oh my God, sitting on a jerry can is so uncomfortable. So let's rewind just a little bit, and if you'll indulge me for a second, I have dived into the Canal archives for an excuse to pull out an old newspaper article, and this is the Illustrated London News of 1899. This is over 125 years old. If you go to patreon.com/CallumRassie, I'll leave up there for free a more high quality scan of this if you just want to look at this in more detail as we're talking. But this is the Royal Engineers at Aldershot, the Bridging Battalion at work, and I think it shows you a good example of what bridging techniques would have looked like. And what's interesting is, if you went back 2,000 years, you'd probably find a Roman legion employing these same techniques to cross these same kinds of rivers and crossings. Now you can see at the bottom here, number 5, placing a platform on pontoons. Then above it here, you have making a floating pier. And then at the top, number 1, the new suspension bridge over the canal constructed by the engineers. And this one you can see using logs and railway sleepers and the like, and pieces of wood to cut to length to create the sides and the roadway. But even by the time that this article was being written in 1899, experiments were ongoing for better solutions to this. There was the Bangalore Infantry Bridge, probably the earliest example of this, of a prefabricated infantry portable bridge that could be used to to quickly cross gaps and spans. But really, the arms race for better bridging solutions really picked up speed during the First World War. And undoubtedly, one of the most famous and successful early designs was the Inglis portable military bridge designed by Charles Edward Inglis. The Inglis Bridge used tubular steel members connected at these cast junction boxes and using slightly large and awkward transoms to create a roadway at the bottom. Now, I believe there is only one Inglis Bridge, the original Mark I bridge, left in existence. And funnily enough, it is also down in Aldershot. Now, it is just crossing this small river. I believe it carries a sewage pipe or an electrical pipe or something. And I've not been down to see it, but I did send a friend down there to get some footage of it. It actually looks surprisingly modern, despite the fact that it is over a century old. The Inglis Bridge was light enough for infantry to manhandle. It was quick to put together, and it could be used to support quite heavy loads. It was originally intended for infantry and pack horses and the like, but it was gradually upgraded over the course of the First World War to accept light vehicles and even heavy early tanks like the Mark V. There's footage of one being used essentially to create a small portable ferry to cross gaps and rivers. And you have to remember that we're talking about the closing stages of the First World War, and the Western Front at this point was not the stagnant trench warfare that we think of. It was incredibly mobile. Front lines were moving all the time, and the ability to quickly cross gaps and spans was becoming increasingly important. I think a really good example of this is actually the Battle of Canal du Nord in September 1918. There was this large length, I think it was a 60-mile stretch of canal, that the Germans had systematically flooded and destroyed many of the crossings over, basically making it impassable. And the Allies had to throw everything they could at it to create crossings over these sections and points in the canal. Now, basically every different type of bridging solution was employed and used, and it's the only battle I can find where you can actually find photographic evidence of basically all these different bridges being used. There are the more traditional examples of causeways being built out of rubble and the like, crossings that were repaired using wood and stone and girders. You can see obviously the Inglis Bridge, which was becoming the quite accepted standard in the British Army, but you can also see competing designs. You can see a good example of a Hopkins Bridge. It was a cheaper, stronger rival to the Inglis, which had to be welded, but it was built over this really wide stretch of the canal near the town of Havrincourt. This hodgepodge of different designs was obviously a logistical problem. There was a lack of consistency, but also these different bridge designs all had inherent and quite strong strengths and weaknesses, whether it be the Inglis Bridge, Hopkins, the Box Girder Bridge, the Callender Hamilton Bridge. And this problem was becoming increasingly pertinent to armies because vehicles were getting bigger, munitions were getting bigger, armies were getting larger, and of course there was the advent of tanks, which were only getting heavier, wider and larger. And of course that brings us quite neatly onto our sponsor today, which is Warthunder. Warthunder is the most comprehensive and immersive vehicle combat game ever made. No other game comes close to its blend of exciting, dynamic PvP combat and range of highly detailed vehicles to fight it out in. There's over 2,500 vehicles to command, from biplanes and battleships to modern jets and main battle tanks, with each one modelled to a breathtaking level of detail and accuracy. I've always been a bit obsessed with the Churchill tank, especially the Mark I, and it's such a unique vehicle, this huge, slow-moving behemoth, a mobile bunker on wheels with almost impenetrable frontal armour and two main guns. But also, the reason that the Bailey Bridge came into existence was because of the development of heavy tanks like the Churchill. The Churchill was tipping the scales at close to 40 tons, a stat that I managed to confirm by going and kitting out my tank in Warthunder and seeing all of the detailed statistics listed alongside it. And it was these huge new heavy tanks coming onto the scene that made British designers realise that what they had currently for bridging gaps and crossings was not sufficient. So if you want to join the fun, play Warthunder for free today. I'll leave a link in the description below and in the pinned comment. And remember, you can play any way you want, whether it be on mobile, PC, PlayStation, or Xbox. If you're new to the game, or you haven't played in the last 6 months, you'll also receive a massive bonus pack on PC and consoles for a limited time. That includes multiple premium vehicles, an exclusive vehicle decorator Eagle of Valor, 100,000 Silver Lions, and 7 days of Warthunder's premium account. So thanks again for the support, Warthunder. Make sure and click those links in the description and the pinned comment below so that you can get your free bonus packs. And play the Tunisia map, because it's the only one that I've found so far which features an actual, real modelled Bailey Bridge, and I appreciate, as always in this game, the attention to detail. And on that note, let's get back to the video. Donald Coleman Bailey was born in Rotherham in 1901 and studied engineering at Sheffield University. In the late 1920s, he found himself at the Experimental Bridging Establishment in Christchurch, a small and underfunded unit of the War Office. At the beginning, Bailey was the sole civil engineer there, with one draftsman, a few mechanics and labourers, and almost no budget. The EBE's primary focus had been on improving and upgrading existing bridge designs, but to Bailey, each of these designs was compromised by their inherent weaknesses and drawbacks. There were the Inglis Bridges, the front-runners and standard solution since their debut in the First World War, and modified over the years to take increasing weights and sizes, but its tubular steel made it costly, and its carrying capacity was already being pushed to the very limit by the latest tank designs. The large box girder bridge was supremely strong and modular, but, like the cheap and sturdy Hopkins Bridge, was often too heavy and bulky for many frontline applications. Then there was the Callender Hamilton Lattice Bridge, brilliantly innovative, using standardised parts that could be transported and bolted together, but it was notoriously time-consuming and complex to construct. Bailey realised that the solution wasn't more tinkering with old models, but rather starting from scratch, combining the strengths of existing systems into something radically new. As early as 1936, he had been sketching ideas in his spare time at the EBE, but he had been repeatedly turned back by his superiors. Frustrated yet convinced he was right, he kept on working on the idea alone. By late 1940, the latest attempt to upgrade the Inglis Bridge for the new Churchill tank had failed, and the crisis gave Bailey the opening he needed. Soon after the failed Inglis tests, he famously drew the outline of his concept on the back of an envelope, an initial sketch that showed a simple, boxy bridge being launched from one side of a gap to another. But two essential revolutionary components of what would become the Bailey Bridge's genius design were clear to see. The first is the panel. These identical panels were the keystone of the design. 10 feet long, 5 feet high, and weighing around 570 pounds, they were light enough for 6 men to carry, yet robust. They could be pinned together end to end, side by side, or stacked up on top of each other for strength. Best of all, joining them only took minutes. A panel pin and split pin were all that was required. The other components were equally straightforward. Transoms formed the cross-sections that carried the wooden roadway. Sway braces bolted underneath prevented lateral movement. And as the panels and transoms were constructed, each new section could be pushed out across rollers until the bridge itself began to span the gap without any help from winches or cranes. But how to solve the problem that plagued most of these bridging solutions? How to stop the advancing span from tipping into the river before it reached the far bank? And, under enemy fire, how could it be done with the least amount of setup possible on the opposite side? Bailey's second insight, also scrawled on that envelope, was the answer: the nose. I think perhaps a small demonstration is in order. There's actually some fantastic footage of Donald Bailey himself explaining the concept of the Bailey Bridge and the nose using this exact same layout. He was a very passionate pipe smoker, so he used a bunch of matchboxes, which I have here. So the stacks of books represent the two sides of the embankment with the gap in the middle that we're trying to cross with the bridge. And these matchboxes represent the assembled sections of the Bailey Bridge. So you take your transoms and panels, pin them together, you've got one section, another section, and you can keep making it up and adding to it to make it as long or as strong as you want. So we begin assembling our Bailey Bridge on one side of the embankment. And the advantage of the Bailey Bridge is all of this can be assembled on site on one side of the crossing, just using manpower, simple tools, with all the parts delivered just on the back of a lorry. So the bridge is now constructed, and it's been constructed on a set of rollers, which means that using manpower or a lorry or a tank, you can start to push it across the gap. But of course the problem is, eventually there'll be too much weight over this point, and the whole thing will tip into the gap before it can reach the other side. What to do? Well, in the case of the Bailey Bridge, what we do is we take more sections here. But these sections are lighter, illustrated here by taking the matches out of the box. These are sections of the bridge that have been stripped down just to their barest essentials. So just basically the transoms and the panels pinned together, no roadway or sway bar or any extra sections. And these are added onto the end. So now we have the constructed bridge with these two lighter sections at the front. And as we start to push it across the rollers, as you can see, it makes it far further without tipping into the gap. But you can see another problem now. The natural sag of the bridge means that it's not going to reach up and over the other side of the embankment. Or what if you're faced with an embankment that is higher than the side that you're building on? Well, again, the Bailey Bridge solves this using the nose. We take another lightened section of bridge and we attach it to the end, but the loose link lets it sit up at an angle, like so. Now, as we push the bridge back across, you have your fully constructed bridge acting as the weight at the back here, and all your men or tanks or trucks pushing it across on the rollers. You have your lightened sections at the front, and another lightened section here which is angled upwards, known as the nose. So we push it across. As you can see, the nose counteracts the sag of the bridge, allows it to clear the other side of the embankment. The nose is deconstructed. The lightened sections are now strengthened with the roadway and the extra parts of the bridge, and you now have a fully open, fully constructed bridge, not requiring really any assistance on the other side of the embankment. Now, of course, this is all great in theory. Now Donald Bailey had to take this concept and put it into action. So, on the 14th of February 1942, Bailey's suggestion for a new bridge design was accepted, and he was given until the 1st of May 1942 to produce, with the EBE, a full-size prototype of his Bailey Bridge. An amazing task to bring together the fabrication and the planning of a full-scale bridge that had been nothing more than paper designs and sketches in only a few months. But they were able to do it, and the trials of the Bailey Bridge are fascinating in and of themselves. Most of them took place, I believe, down in Christchurch, where the EBE barracks was. In fact, I believe one of the original prototype Bailey Bridges, or part of it, is actually still down there, and you can go and walk across it and marvel at one of the very, very first Bailey Bridges in existence. But photographs of the testing really shows you how rigorous it was. So what they ended up doing was taking Mark V World War I era tanks, piling them onto the bridge, and then driving more tanks on top of those, and then filling all of those tanks with scrap metal and materials so that they could really test just how much weight these bridges could take. It makes for some absolutely crazy photos, and the Bailey Bridge passed all tests. In fact, it exceeded the expectations of the designers, and as a result it was immediately commissioned for use in the army. You have to remember, a lot of bridging equipment and materials in general had been left behind during the fall of France and then the subsequent evacuation at Dunkirk. And planning was currently underway alongside the Americans for an invasion of North Africa, and as a result, a lot of extra equipment, including bridging equipment, would be needed. But that's the problem. The entire country was in a war footing, rearming, building planes, tanks, munitions, arms, helmets, everything that you could possibly imagine. Where was the extra capacity going to come from to build a whole bunch of components for the Bailey Bridge? Well, what they ended up doing was something really clever. They created a massive network of factories and manufacturers around the country. There was over 650 different factories and manufacturers that were retooled for producing parts for the Bailey Bridge. One of the advantages of the Bailey Bridge was its relative simplicity. And everything from automotive makers, department stores like Littlewoods, and furniture makers had their factories and manufacturers retooled for the production of Bailey Bridge materials. Now, this sort of decentralised network of manufacturers and factories making all these different parts for the Bailey Bridges started in around late 1941, and it worked surprisingly well. By 1945, they'd produced 500,000 tonnes of Bailey Bridge parts, enough for about 200 miles of bridges. And this stuff had to be produced fast, and it also had to be produced with a lot of skill and accuracy. 650 different factories and manufacturers meant that you had lots of chances for parts not fitting or working together. And they relied on master jigs, master copies of these different panels and pins, and also loads of constant interchangeability checks. Now, the first initial deployments of the bridge in combat were in North Africa, in Tunisia, in November 1942, and it proved incredibly effective and incredibly popular by sappers and engineers, and obviously the troops who were using them. But really, its effect wouldn't be truly seen until Sicily and the invasion of Italy. The sheer scale of Bailey bridging during the Italian campaign is truly crazy. The US 5th Army and the British 8th Army erected over 3,000 Bailey bridges in Italy, some 55 miles of bridges in total. And I think the thing that often gets lost in this is just the sheer ingenuity and bravery and fortitude of the sappers in these engineering battalions who were responsible for creating these bridgeheads, who had to move to the very front lines to these embankments in the middle of the night and desperately try to get these bridges across. An entire campaign, an entire battle, but thus an entire campaign could hinge upon whether we could get armour, materials, men across these bridges at this exact time. The stresses and strain that they were working under was tremendous. The Battle of Monte Cassino is a good example, where there was two huge bridges built across. I believe it was the Congo and the Amazon were their nicknames. And the construction of the Amazon was under constant, relentless enemy fire. There were over a dozen sappers killed, 57 wounded in the construction of this bridge. And it maybe gives you an idea of why these bridges became ultimately so unbelievably beloved by the sappers and the engineers and the troops that were being carried across them. As a result of its impact on the battlefield, the use of the Bailey Bridge and its development was quite a well-kept secret amongst the Allies, certainly until after D-Day, when it was used again heavily in France and then crossing the Rhine. Following this, though, you can see a spate of newspaper articles come out around 1944, 1945, when obviously the cover was lifted and the Wonder Bridge, as it was hailed, was revelled and celebrated in many of the papers around the UK and in America. And to thousands of people back home in Britain reading these newspapers, they were reading for the first time about their direct contribution to the war. Think about all those bedstead makers and the folks in the Little Woods factories that had been retooled to produce parts for the Bailey Bridge. All of a sudden they were reading about the impact that their work had had on the war effort. And you can see so many articles about this being the engineer's best friend, the sapper's best friend, the saviour to many armies and campaigns. And you can also see quite a lot of quotes from soldiers and like going, "Who is Donald Bailey?" But I think the longevity of the Bailey Bridge, its use all the way up till today, really illustrates just how much of a success its design was and what genius it was that Bailey and his team at the EBE landed on with that initial concept of the Bailey Bridge. And I think one of my favourite books is this, Bailey Bridge Normal Uses. This is a book that basically details the instructions on how to put together a basic Bailey Bridge, but then all the various different designs or standard designs that you can create out of it. I absolutely love it. It says here, the official War Office publication. So you can see here, Bailey Bridge fixed span, object and general uses of equipment. These are the two most common ways of arranging the panels and transom. So you've got your roadway in the center, but then you've got either the triple single and double do sound like burger orders at McDonald's or something, but that is what they call it. And then if we go through here, always love this. This is we've looked at this before, but this is your panel, the pin, the transom, the core components of the Bailey Bridge. And then I like this little illustration of the panel being carried. You can see it just takes 6 men to carry a panel for a Bailey Bridge. If you've seen it earlier in the video, there's a photo of a panel being carried for a section of a box girder bridge, and it uses something like 27 men to carry it, which really shows you the improvement and portability that the Bailey Bridge offered. But then my favourite part in this whole thing is later on here. You can open this up, and this is various plans for Bailey Bridges. So you can see this is quite a standard one here. You've got the side profile, you've got the plan looking down, you've got the end elevation, you can see the panels, everything listed. You can actually see a footway here. Oftentimes there was a footway on the outside for pedestrians so that it wouldn't impede with any of the traffic that was travelling along the centre roadway. And then of course you've got extra uses here. Very common to see it used to create floating piers, pontoons, floating bridges of course as well if you're crossing large spans. That was done on the Rhine during the closing stages of the Second World War as well too. I think this book is just a work of art. I think it's absolutely gorgeous. I bought this a long time ago and I just think the illustrations in here are amazing. Everything is broken down really simply. In fact, if you go to the back, you can even see here what the different damages to transoms will do and the effects that it will have on the carrying capacity of the bridge. You can basically calculate a bridge for any gap or span just using this book. And you can kind of imagine being a trainee sapper or approaching perhaps maybe a valley with a collapsed bridge out in Italy and pulling out your copy of Bailey Bridge Normal Uses and going like, right, what are we going to use to tackle this? And then perhaps realizing that this book doesn't cover it. So you get out your next book, which is Bailey Bridge special uses, which goes into even more specific uses for Bailey Bridges. And this is things like, for example, suspension bridges. I believe the first Bailey Bridge suspension bridge was built in Burma during the Second World War. And again, it just highlights the adaptability of the Bailey Bridge. And again, to this day, they are used heavily. They are produced, relatively speaking, without many changes and used throughout the world, still in their original World War II form. In fact, most Bailey Bridges, and if you start to recognize them, you'll kind of see them everywhere, but most Bailey Bridges that you'll find out in the middle of nowhere are often ex-World War II Cold War surplus. The bridge that I filmed at the very start of this video is probably, if not World War II, late 1950s or early 1950s, late 1960s surplus that was given and used by the Forestry Commission in this case to create that bridge. I would say though that my favourite use of the Bailey Bridge actually comes from this book, A Bridge to Victory, the best telling of the story of Donald Bailey and the invention of the Bailey Bridge. But in this, it has a bunch of photos of Bailey Bridge uses throughout the years. And you can see this one here. The versatility of the Bailey Bridge concept provided this launching tower and its supports for the successful Skylark rocket test in Australia in 1957. The structure was used many times. So started off as a bridging solution for the invasion of North Africa and Italy, and ended up just a few years later being used for rocket tests in Australia. Again, versatility and longevity. Those are the two things that I think really come together to create great design. And the Bailey Bridge, I think, is an example of that. Something that is so unbelievably versatile and has had such incredible longevity, all owed to a sketch made on the back of an envelope by, Sir Donald Bailey, because I believe he was made a knight in, he received his knighthood, I think, in 1946. Quite a quiet-spoken man, I believe, who was, a civil engineer at heart, created this solution, like I mentioned at the start, in a damp room somewhere in England, drawing and sketching out ideas that would, have such a massive, profound impact on the Second World War. But that is the story of the Bailey Bridge. This has been a really fun video. I was trying to find a video that was a bit easier for me to produce because, as you guys may have seen in my last video, I just had a child. And, there's a lot of responsibility that comes with that. One is the fact that it's not very easy to get out and visit places. I can't really easily fly to Alaska anymore and go look at giant overland trains. So I thought, well, there's a Bailey Bridge just up the road. I had my Bailey Bridge normal uses book here available to me, so I thought, well, I'll read through that, and I ended up getting lost in the subject somewhat. If you are interested in the story of bridging, if you're interested in military bridging, especially if you're interested in the Inglis Bridge, actually, I'd really recommend an amazing website. I've been reading it for years, called Think Defence. I'll leave a link in the description below. Think Defence writes about every conceivable small niche logistical army solution that you could think of, basically, specifically around the British Army. And he's written a fantastic history on the Inglis Bridges, the bridges that we talked about near the start of the video that kind of preceded the Bailey Bridge. And I don't believe he's written an article on Bailey Bridges yet. Although I feel like years and years ago I remember reading one of his, but he may have taken it down. Maybe he's working on a new one at the moment. But his stuff is incredibly in-depth, and his stuff was really useful for researching, like I say, the early predecessors to the Bailey Bridge, like the Inglis Bridge and the like. But I think he has a quote. It's never a good day. A good day is a day with a bridge. That's what he says, which I think is so accurate. There's nothing like getting your teeth into some nice, juicy civil engineering. But yeah, Think Defence. I'll leave a link in the description below. And if you go to Patreon, thanks again to my Patreons for all the support. If you go to patreon.com/CallumRassie, I'll leave a link to this if you wanted to see it up close. But I'll also leave some scans of things from the Bailey Bridge book, because some of these are just absolutely fantastic. If you do go to, I think it's actually linked in the Wikipedia page for the Bailey Bridge, there is a manual, the US manual for the Bailey Bridge construction, which has quite a lot of this as well too, but it's not the beautiful hand-drawn draftsman style stuff. But yeah, a lot of fun. This one was quite an interesting video to put together because I'd wished I'd got the chance to maybe like get down to Christchurch and see the original Bailey Bridge. I'd love to maybe get a chance to go see some other Bailey Bridges. I know that sounds like a very nerdy thing to do, but a little bit like how I did my video about the airway arrows, it would be quite nice to go around and maybe collect some Bailey Bridges. And I hope, if you're interested in these, every time you spot a bridge now, you might be wondering, is that a Bailey Bridge? Is that a... what is that? Is that a Hopkins? Is that a Calendar Hamilton? There's quite a few Calendar Hamilton bridges out there. And it became a little bit of a controversy because Calendar Hamilton, the inventor of that, sort of challenged in court the assertion that Donald Bailey had invented the Bailey Bridge and hadn't really ripped off the Calendar Hamilton Bridge. And eventually it was found that, you know, Bailey had come up with his concept and idea. It differed in quite significant ways. But you'll see that in quite a lot of the old news articles of the day as the court battle. It's not really a court battle, but they were awarding money for the inventions, basically, and there was kind of hearings being held about who the true inventors and the like were. But anyway, I'm going to head off now. I've got some editing to do because I'm recording this outro quite last minute. But thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye. Oh, and thanks again for the support, Warthunder. Check the link in description below, and I'll leave a link where you can sign up using my code. Did you guys notice how bang on they got that bridge in the Tunisia map with the real bridge? I believe that photograph shows the first real use of the Bailey Bridge in a combat situation where they span this stone bridge in Tunisia. I forget the exact location. And Warthunder, in their attention to detail, managed to recreate that bridge almost perfectly. And I didn't realise that until I was doing this edit right now, because I didn't find that photograph until quite late on. So thanks again for the support, Warthunder. But wow, commitment to detail. The reason I always appreciate them. Anyway, bye-bye.